We saw in Montana this last year a kind of interesting phenomenon. My understanding is that you were trying to return back some money to the state or to the federal government, and ended up being told no, and the money ended up getting spent anyway. What happened with that?
Well, when we presented our budget to the governor for his signature, for the first time in history, the Montana legislature sent the budget to the governor on the 75th day of a 90-day session. And because we did that on purpose so the governor could respond, and the governor said he was going to veto the budget unless we agreed to accepting the federal money. And we had basically passed a budget that would reject a lot of the federal money, about $130 million worth. And when we went to the governor, he came back and said he was not going to sign the budget. He would veto it and call a special session unless we agreed to accept the federal money. And in the end, that's what we ended up doing, because the budget doesn't pass if the governor says he's going to veto it. So in that case, the Democratic governor, Brian Schweitzer, said no. And in the end, we had really, other than go into special session over and over again, we ended up accepting, in our compromise negotiations with him, we agreed to accept the federal money, but the legislature itself had voted to reject it.
And in rejecting it, was it your expectation that that would go back to the federal government to repay, to help pay down the debt? And what were you told when you were trying to do that to pay down the debt? Does it in fact just get sent elsewhere?
Well, we knew that, I mean, the argument was, is if you don't accept it, some other state's going to accept it and spend it. And we knew it wasn't going to go for paying down the federal debt, and that's what, as you know, Congressman Rehberg has a proposal to make that possible, and it would allow a state to cooperate with federal government and federal funding, and if there's federal funding that the state decides it doesn't need or doesn't want to accept, it could be used to reduce debt. So it is a good proposal to allow states and Congress to work together. In our particular case, Montana's total budget is over 50% federal money, and we just made the conscious decision that we have to begin weaning ourselves off the federal money, given the size of the federal debt, now at $14 trillion, that we had to start somewhere. And so that's what we started to try to do, and the governor blocked that.
It just seems a little bit of common sense that if the state legislature in Montana says they don't want to spend the money, that it should be able to go back to the federal government and not go to be sent off to another state to spend elsewhere. A state that's frugal and wants to do the right thing and help with the budget deficit ought to be able to do just that and not have the money frittered away elsewhere, don't you think?
Well, that's very true. But again, that's up to Congress. Congress is going to have to make that change so that the federal money that a state rejects will then go to reducing the federal debt, and I think that's what Congressman Rehberg is trying to do. I support that. I think it's a good idea. It allows a state to contribute to reducing the federal deficit. As you know now, it just goes back in and gets reallocated to another state. The same was true with the stimulus money, by the way, and that's obviously the argument that the governor made for accepting it, is why shouldn't Montana accept it when it's going to go to another state? And in the end, you know, because of his executive power to veto the budget, we ended up having to compromise with the governor.
It's an interesting story and an anecdote that we need to hear in Washington, that there are people back in the states who want to try to cut the budget. They want to try to help out by not spending all the money. And Congressman Rehberg is one who wants to actually take the next step and allow that to occur, so that $100 million can go to pay down the debt rather than being spent on stuff that you didn't believe that it was needed for in the state of Montana. That's really a powerful story. Well, that's the problem. What can you do about it?
Well, I've introduced legislation. It's called the REFUND Act, and ironically, in the Senate, my compatriot, Mr. Rubio, has introduced the Senate version of the same bill. And what we're suggesting, and this idea came from a former Speaker of the House in the Montana legislature, a fellow by the name of John Mercer, great speaker. He's a lawyer up in Polson, Montana. And he called up one day and he said, you know, take the argument away. Allow the opportunity for a state to say, we don't want the money, and rather than sending it back to the original category within the budget to be redistributed by the bureaucracy, allow it to go to debt retirement. And so I introduced legislation, the REFUND Act, that suggests that if Montana doesn't want the $125 million, it doesn't go to be redistributed, it goes back to debt retirement.